Welcome back to Things of Interest for a look at something I've wanted to have in my collection for quite a while now. This is Donkey Kong, my first Game & Watch handheld. Yes, you're probably thinking, AK, you already did a video on Game & Watch Ball. Well, that was a replica from Club Nintendo made in 2009. This is one of the originals all the way from 1982, which probably makes this the oldest Nintendo-related item in my collection so far, seeing the only two video game-related things that Nintendo has released before this are arcade games and the color TV game systems. Both of those still fetch a pretty penny, and the Game & Watch systems are getting up there as well. While I don't think I have the budget to collect a whole bunch of Game & Watch handhelds given their prices, if I had to pick one of them, it would have to be Donkey Kong for multiple reasons. First of all, just look at that design. This is one of the first Game & Watch units in the multi-screen series, and while many people have probably already told you that it was the inspiration for the design of the DS, it is still very fascinating to see this folding form factor being employed all these years ago, even before the age of laptop computers. The way it folds open and locks shut was actually inspired by makeup compacts, as a similar object that people would carry around in public. I suppose the hinge could have used some more work though. It's not gonna break off completely, but the ribbon cable connecting the two screens together is just kind of exposed in the middle there. There were even explicit warnings in the manual to not damage it. Probably didn't stop some kids trying to stick a pencil in it. It's well worth the double screen setup though, which is notable since this is one of the very first adaptations of the original Donkey Kong. While previous Game & Watch games have been simple minigames featuring nameless characters, this is the first to be based on an existing Nintendo property. And since the original game was all about ascending different structures from construction sites to factories, it totally makes sense to transplant it to a two-screen setup, with you going from the bottom to the top. Like the original game, the controls are super simple, with a single jump button and the directional pad in its first appearance ever. Yes, this is the first D-pad ever used in a piece of electronics. The point of the D-pad was to have a compact way of letting you input directions without needing to look at what buttons you're pressing, and the curvature of this D-pad totally accomplishes that. It's on the small side compared to the D-pads of today, but it still feels comfortable and reliable. They nailed it so much on their first try that these Game & Watch units were used as prototype Famicom controllers, eventually becoming the gamepad we all know and love. Maybe it's time I talked about actually playing the thing. This unit takes two LR44 or SR44 watch batteries. Can we also take a moment to admire this initialization screen? The Game & Watch character designs are charming, no doubt, but also looking at the limited screen size and elements they had to work with, it just makes the animation work we see later on look even more impressive. Also, note how the time on the bottom right uses a 12-hour display. Older Game & Watch units used 24-hour displays, but with the limited amount of LCD segments to work with, it was actually more resourceful to dedicate 3 segments to AM, PM, and 1 rather than displaying a full number with 7 of them. Just some interesting little trivia there. I also love how the background isn't just one flat image. There are multiple layers which provide some 3D depth and makes the whole thing look like an electronic diorama. It's super mesmerizing to look at. Like all other Game & Watch units, you have 2 game modes, with Game B being a harder version of Game A. For demonstration purposes, I'll be showing gameplay footage from the version of the game found in Game & Watch Collection on the DS, seeing that these games have already been ported to multiple Nintendo handhelds at this point and I can get some higher quality footage from them. You play as none other than Mario, starting from the bottom screen and making your way up to the top. Of course, this is a Game & Watch, so you don't actually move around, you just teleport between preset locations. Like the arcade game, Donkey Kong throws barrels that roll down towards you, and this time you can only jump over them when there's room above you, or else you'll have to move back. You also have to be careful not to bump into these iron girders that occasionally move across the ceiling on higher difficulties. You can keep jumping in place over the barrels to rack up your score, but doing so will cause them to speed up and eventually to ludicrous speeds, so you gotta make it to the top if you don't want to waste one of your lives. Once you reach the top screen, things play out a little differently. You have to hit left to flick the switch, which activates this crane, and jump towards it when it swings to the left, cutting one of the wires next to Donkey Kong. If you jump at the wrong time, you fall and you lose a life. Good to see that this faithful adaptation keeps Mario's ridiculous fall damage. Anyway, you repeat this process 3 more times until all the wires are cut. The girders collapse and you win the game to do it all over again, only getting to replenish a life every 300 points. It is admittedly simple, but considering the limitations of LCD games, it's a really solid and well-designed interpretation of the original arcade game. This is part of the reason why folks agree that Game & Watch units are in a league of their own compared to the likes of Tiger Electronics. The mix of metal and plastic gives them a sturdy build and a very classy look without coming off as cheap, and they actually have well thought out gameplay and control. It appeals not just to kids but to everyone who's looking to waste some time on a train ride or whatever, and that's evident in the marketing as well. And with the historical significance that they had on Nintendo's entry into the video game market, Game & Watch units are now seen as collectible antiques, just like how some people like to collect vintage watches. Alright, there's a watch inside this Game & Watch. Almost forgot. There are two small buttons next to the game selection buttons that you can only press with a sharp object. This ACL button here simply resets the game to the initialization state. Actually, side note, but I've looked all around while writing the script and nowhere in Nintendo sources do they ever mention what ACL stands for. Even the Tiger Electronic Games manuals mention it, but only by the acronym. I'm guessing it stands for All Clear, but it's just so weird that there's hardly any definitive source for this. Either that or it's a common acronym for electronics and I'm a big dum-dum. Anyway, the button on top of that is the alarm switch. Pushing it down lets you set the alarm time, and pushing it again toggles the alarm on and off. And when it goes off... Ooh, sheesh, people in the 80s had it rough, man. Imagine the poor sod that had to wake up to this Game & Watch every morning. Also, in Game & Watch tradition, a character appears on screen ringing a bell when the alarm goes off. And no, that's not Donkey Kong Jr. He's still 2 months away from appearing in his own game. According to the manual, this is Mini Donkey Kong, and he has not appeared in another original game since. Bring him back, Nintendo. And yeah, that's Donkey Kong on the Game & Watch. If you wanted to play this specific version of the game today, you can do so on the Game & Watch compilations on the Game Boy and DS. But to be honest, there is just something magical about playing the original, with the multi-layered screen, smooth artwork, and the first ever D-pad. Seeing as LCD games are barely a thing anymore in today's world, this is like the perfect combination of history and novelty. I'm glad to finally have it in my collection, and I hope its condition can still hold up years from now. The Game & Watch games play just as well as they did 40 years ago, and are definitely a testament to Nintendo's game design expertise. While today, most mainstream audiences will probably only know them from Smash Bros., these handheld games will certainly still continue to be seen as things of interest.